so big.
Slow down.
Ask 10 people whether America or Europe offers the better life, and you'll get 10 confident answers, and almost none of them will mention a single real number. Everybody's got a cousin who moved to Lisbon, or a friend who says they'd never survive without the NHS, or a coworker who swears European taxes would bankrupt them. So let's actually fix that. This isn't a story about which side wins. It's a story about what the numbers actually say, because both sides of this argument are half right, and both sides are usually arguing from vibes instead of evidence. By the end, you'll probably still have a preference, but at least it'll be an informed one. Before we get into it, if data-driven breakdowns like this are your thing, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't lose this in your feed, because we're about to go through 8 different categories, and some of the conclusions are going to surprise people on both sides of this argument. Let's start with money, because that's where the loudest claims live and where the numbers are the most misused. American paychecks are, on average, genuinely bigger. A mid-level software engineer in the U.S. earns roughly $8,300 a month gross, compared to about $5,600 in Germany and $5,800 in the UK. Switzerland is really the only European economy that competes on raw pay, sitting around $7,800 a month. Zoom out to the OECD's 2026 wage report, and the picture holds. Gross average annual pay across Europe ranges from about 18,590 euros in Turkey up to 107,487 euros in Switzerland, with most of Western Europe. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, sitting well below equivalent American wages once you convert currencies. Unemployment tells a similar story. In early 2026, the U.S. rate sat around 4.4%, compared to 5.9% across the EU, 6.2% in the euro area specifically, and double digits in Spain at 11.4%. Youth unemployment is even starker among 25 to 29-year-olds. Joblessness reached 15.2% in Spain and nearly 19% in Italy in late 2025. On the surface, that's a clean American win. More jobs, higher pay, less friction getting into the workforce. But paychecks aren't income, and gross pay isn't take-home pay. Here's where it gets more complicated. Top marginal tax rates actually look similar on paper. The U.S. tops out around 37%. Federally, France reaches 45%, Germany hits 45% as well, but marginal rates are a bad way to compare real burdens because they ignore what each side is buying with that money. At a $50,000 salary, one 2026 comparative tax analysis found the U.S. actually carries the lightest combined tax and contribution burden of the group. But Germany's mandatory social contributions push its effective rate dramatically higher at that same income level. And that's specifically because those contributions are funding healthcare and pensions that Americans have to purchase separately, often through their employer, if they get them at all. On the employer side, the gap is even more visible. When a European employer pays someone a $75,000 gross salary, their real employment costs, driven by mandatory social contributions, averages around $22,629. compared to roughly $8,881 for the same salary in the U.S. That difference isn't wasted money. It's healthcare, parental leave, and pension funding baked directly into the cost of employing someone, rather than billed to the employee later as a separate expense. So the honest framing isn't Americans pay less tax. It's Americans pay less tax and then buy privately what Europeans get automatically. And whether that trade favors you personally depends entirely on how much of that private buying you'd actually need to do. Which brings us to healthcare. And this is where the American growth story runs into its biggest asterisk. The U.S. spent about $14,900 per person on healthcare in 2024, 17.6% of GDP, which is roughly 80% higher than the OECD average of 9.2%. For that spending, Americans get shorter lives, not longer ones. U.S. life expectancy sits around 78.4 years, compared to roughly 81 to 82 years across the OECD and EU averages, according to the Peterson KFF Health System Tracker, and that 3 to 4 year gap has been widening, not closing, since the early 1980s, when American and European life expectancies were nearly identical.
This is our first time.
Honey?
On the chicken.
Wait, where'd you get honey
Where do you
from?
get honey?
They have it in the packet.
Oh, we should get
What,
some
on
honey.
the chicken?
On the chicken.
How often do you guys come? Every Sunday? Yeah.
Right. Oh wow, look at that. Wow. This feels more technical.
I mean, with the biscuits, they were greatly improved by the honey glaze, right?
True, that's true.
So, all right.
Alright.
Maternal mortality in the U.S. was 18.6 deaths per 100,000 live births in 2023, several times higher than most European countries. Infant mortality in the EU sits around 3.3 deaths per 1,000 live births, versus roughly 5.6 in the U.S. And this isn't just an American problem relative to rich countries. Broadly, Spain spends far less per capita on healthcare than the U.S. and still posts some of the best health outcomes on the planet, including high life expectancy and low avoidable death rates, according to the Commonwealth Fund's 2026 Global Comparison. The honest read here isn't American healthcare is bad. American hospitals, specialists, and medical technology are often the best in the world. That's precisely why so many wealthy foreign patients fly to the U.S. for specific procedures. The real story is that the system is extremely expensive to access consistently, and that access gap is dragging down population-wide outcomes, even while the ceiling of what's medically possible in America stays higher than almost anywhere else. Now, retirement. And this is one of the categories that flips the script back toward America, at least for people who save. The average Social Security retirement benefit in the U.S. was $2,071 a month as of January 2026, and that's before counting any private savings on top of it. Americans aged 65 to 74 hold average retirement savings of $609,230, according to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, though the median is a much more modest $200,000, which tells you the average is being pulled upward by a wealthy minority. Empower's March 2026 data put average U.S. retirement savings across all age groups at $547,840, with Americans in their 60s averaging north of $1.2 million. Compare that to the EU's average public old age pension of about €17,321 a year in 2023, roughly $1,587 a month, and you can see why American retirees who save consistently often end up with a larger personal cushion than their European counterparts. But notice the phrase, "who saved consistently." The European system guarantees a floor that's very hard to fall through, regardless of your personal saving discipline, while the American system rewards people who saved well and can leave others with only Social Security to lean on. Education debt is worth a beat here too, because it's one of the more one-sided categories in this whole comparison. The average American public university student borrows just under $32,000 for a bachelor's degree, and total U.S. student debt is still climbing up more than $57 billion year over year in early 2026 alone. Compare that to Germany, where average debt at graduation sits around $10,000 in equivalent dollars, largely because tuition is minimal or free. Now, it's not a totally clean story. Some Scandinavian countries with free tuition, like Norway, actually show higher borrowing than you'd expect, because their loan systems fund generous living expenses on top of school. But for the core comparison, most people care about walking out of a four-year degree, carrying a life-altering debt load. The American system produces that outcome far more often and far more severely than most of Western Europe. Housing is where the physical scale argument is actually true and not exaggerated for effect. The median size of a newly built American single-family home is around 2,300 square feet. Compare that to typical new European homes. Germany around 946 to 1,185 square feet. France around 957 to 1,228. The UK near the bottom of the pack at roughly 850 to 1,000 square feet. That's not a stereotype. Americans really do build homes roughly twice the size of their European counterparts, driven by cheaper land, looser zoning, and a culture that treats square footage as a status marker in a way most of Europe simply doesn't. But bigger isn't the same as more secure. U.S. homeownership sat around 65.2% at the start of 2025, actually below the EU average of about 69%, and well below countries like Albania, Slovakia, or Lithuania, where ownership tops 90%. Meanwhile, some of Europe's wealthiest countries, Germany and Switzerland, have the lowest ownership rates on the continent, under 50%, because renting there is simply a more normalized, more protected, longer-term arrangement than it tends to be in the U.S. So the fair picture isn't Europe rents, America owns. It's Americans own bigger houses on average. Europeans, taken as a whole, own homes at a slightly higher rate. They're just smaller, and ownership patterns vary enormously by country.
And some lovely dancing going on as well here. I wish I could dance.
Safety is probably the most emotionally loaded category in this entire debate, and it deserves precision instead of outrage. The U.S. homicide rate, about 6.4 per 100,000 people, is the highest among wealthy developed nations, several times higher than the UK's roughly 1.2 or Japan's 0.3. U.S. incarceration sits around 531 per 100,000 people, 5 to 10 times higher than most European peers, and the U.S. holds one of the highest per capita incarceration rates on Earth, despite representing only about 4% of the world's population. Firearms are the clear driver here. The U.S. gun homicide rate runs roughly 200 times Japan's. That's a real and serious gap, and it isn't up for debate. But crime data isn't one-directional, and a fair comparison has to include the categories where Europe's numbers are less flattering. The EU logged over 5 million theft offenses and roughly 1.2 million burglaries in 2024. Several European countries have also seen sharp increases in knife crime and reported sexual offenses.
Bring me into golden sunlight.
Over the past decade, Germany recorded around 29,000 knife-related criminal offenses in 2024 alone, an average of 79 a day, while knife crime in England and Wales rose 87% over 10 years. So the fair version of this comparison isn't Europe is safe, America is dangerous. It's America has a uniquely severe lethal violence problem tied specifically to firearm access, while several major European countries are dealing with rising property crime and knife violence that simply doesn't register in the same headline homicide statistic. Different risks, not an absence of risk on either side. Before we get to time, let's talk about what all those paychecks and taxes actually buy, because who earns more and who lives better are not the same question, and cost of living is the variable that connects them. On Numbeo's 2026 index, the U.S. ranks 19th globally for cost of living, already an expensive country by world standards. But Europe spans a far wider range on the exact same scale than most people assume. Groceries in Germany run roughly 37% cheaper than in the US, a pattern that holds across much of Western Europe, and rent is typically 30 to 45% cheaper across Western Europe compared to equivalent American cities, with Southern and Eastern Europe running 40 to 60% cheaper still. Healthcare is the single biggest hidden line item Americans spend, somewhere between $6,000 and $12,000 more per year than Europeans for equivalent coverage, once you account for premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs. But American wages, which run 30 to 60% higher across comparable roles, largely offset that gap for people who are actually employed full-time in the U.S. system. Where the math gets genuinely lopsided is remote work. An American earning $80,000 a year while living in Portugal or Spain will often outpurchase someone earning $120,000 in Austin or Denver, because they're collecting an American salary while paying Southern European prices. That's not a lifestyle opinion. That's arithmetic, and the range within Europe itself is enormous. Switzerland, Norway, and Denmark are more expensive than most American cities, Manhattan included, while a single person can live comfortably in a smaller Portuguese city on somewhere between $1,300 and $1,900 a month, all in. So Europe is cheaper and America is cheaper are both true, depending entirely on which European country and which American city you're actually comparing. The honest takeaway is that neither continent has a single price tag, and anyone who tells you it does is skipping the part of the story that would actually help you decide. Then there's the question of time, how much of your life you actually get to keep for yourself, outside of work. This is the category where Europe's advantage is the least contested of anything in this video. The United States is the only wealthy developed country with no legally mandated paid vacation at all. Roughly 31% of American workers get no paid time off whatsoever. And the average worker who does have access to PTO only uses about 17 days of it a year, often out of guilt or job insecurity. The EU, by contrast, mandates at least 4 weeks of paid leave for every worker as a legal floor, with France requiring 30 days and the UK requiring 28. That's not a cultural quirk you can wave away with "Americans just work harder." It's a structural difference in labor law that simply doesn't have an American equivalent.
And destroyed. If there was South Africa, gosh, first of all, I wouldn't be able to walk through this blimmin' park by myself, holding a pair of glasses and a cell phone. We all know that. But then you get here, and you're completely safe. Completely safe. I mean, like I say, there's women everywhere.
If there's one line in this whole comparison that isn't really debatable, it's that Europeans are guaranteed more of their own time back, by law, than Americans are, full stop. So, tallying it all up across 8 categories: wages and taxes, healthcare, retirement, education debt, housing, safety, cost of living, and time, where does the actual verdict land? Nowhere clean. And that's the honest answer, not a cop-out. If your priorities are take-home pay, retirement savings, home size, and lighter student debt, the data leans toward the U.S. If your priorities are guaranteed time off, healthcare access without financial ruin, longer life expectancy, and a much lower risk of dying by gun violence, the data leans toward Europe. And on at least 2 of these categories, cost of living and overall crime, there isn't even a continent-wide winner, because the honest answer depends entirely on which country and which city you're comparing, not which side of the Atlantic it's on. Neither side is winning some single unified quality of life contest, because quality of life was never one number to begin with. It's a bundle of trade-offs, and different people, entirely reasonably, weigh those trade-offs differently depending on their age, their health, their career stage, their risk tolerance, and what they actually want out of the years they have. A 28-year-old software engineer optimizing for salary and career acceleration is going to look at this data and lean American. A 58-year-old with a chronic health condition who values predictable costs and guaranteed time off is going to look at the exact same data and lean European. Both of them would be reading the numbers correctly. They're just weighting different rows in the same spreadsheet because their lives are different. The version of this debate that shows up in viral videos, confident tourists, dramatic music, a single winner declared by minute 3 isn't wrong because the underlying facts are made up. Individually, a lot of those facts are real. It's wrong because it flattens a genuinely complicated multivariable trade-off into a scoreboard with one final score, and real life was never built to fit on a scoreboard. The moment a video tells you there's one clean winner between 2 entire continents, containing dozens of countries and hundreds of millions of people with wildly different systems, that's usually your signal that something got oversimplified for the sake of a punchy conclusion. So here's the actual question worth sitting with, and it's the only one that really matters once you've seen the numbers. Would you rather earn more and keep less of your time, or earn less and keep more of it? Would you rather take on more personal financial risk in exchange for a higher ceiling, or accept a lower ceiling in exchange for a guaranteed floor? There's no universally correct answer to either question, just the one that's honest about what you actually value at this point in your life, which might look completely different in another 10 years. If you want more breakdowns like this data first, properly sourced, no manufactured winner, no tourist reaction cherry-picking hit like. Share it with someone who's going to argue about this at dinner tonight. And subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss the next one.